In the final moments of October 23, 2077, the world ended not with the slow decay of empires, but with the instantaneous bloom of nuclear fire that erased the known order of humankind, leaving behind a silence so deep that even history seemed to stop breathing. Across the planet, warning sirens howled for seconds before the horizon turned to light. Cities like Washington, D.C., Boston, Los Angeles, and countless others became white-hot suns that devoured everything built over millennia of ambition, while in the brief interval between life and ash, communications broke down, governments vanished, and the last remnants of the old world's confidence dissolved into panic. The United States, already fractured by decades of corporate dominance and political corruption, collapsed within hours. Command bunkers were obliterated, the chain of command severed, and the automated defense systems that once promised deterrence instead became instruments of mutual suicide. In that apocalyptic exchange, whose precise number of detonations no historian can confirm, the Great War consumed humanity's industrial heart, vaporized its capitals, and burned the atmosphere with radioactive dust that dimmed the sun for years to come. When the firestorm passed, a pall of static settled across the airwaves. Satellites fell from orbit, and those who survived the immediate blasts faced a landscape that no longer recognized them. Highways turned to rivers of molten tar, forests to blackened stumps, and the oceans boiled with fallout. Entire species vanished overnight, while others twisted into grotesque reflections of what they once were. The silence that followed was not peace, but the absence of every familiar sound. No traffic, no machinery, only the wind whispering through the bones of cities. In that void, the first survivors emerged from basements, metro tunnels, and the deep shelters of Voltec's engineered arcs, witnessing a sky veiled in nuclear dust that turned noon into twilight. Radios crackled with ghost signals, fragments of automated distress calls, and pre-recorded government assurances repeating long after the senders were dead. The United States, as a political body, no longer existed. Its borders were meaningless under the weight of extinction. Yet within the chaos, the seeds of continuity clung to life. Military remnants, scientists, scavengers, and families, all driven by the same primal instinct to endure. Some survivors found refuge in vaults that had sealed moments before the detonations, their inhabitants unaware that the very company promising salvation had designed many of those facilities as controlled experiments, turning survival into a dataset. Others were less fortunate. Shelters failed, filters clogged, and radiation claimed thousands who believed themselves secure. Outside, those caught in the open experienced the horror of atomic aftermath. Flash-burned landscapes, black rain that carried death in every droplet, and skies that glowed faintly green at night. Within weeks, the infrastructure of civilization collapsed completely. Automated systems like Robcos, Protectrons, and Mister Handies roamed aimlessly without directives, while remnants of military AI continued to execute orders long after their human operators had perished. The Great War lasted only about 2 hours, but its consequences extended beyond the comprehension of any survivor. In those early days, before the emergence of organized factions, the American continent was reduced to isolated pockets of life amid a graveyard of steel and concrete. People scavenged canned food, bottled water, and pre-war technology from the ruins, forming tenuous communities that lived by the hour. Radiation storms swept across the continent, mutating plant and animal life, while the first ghouls, Humans whose bodies had been seared yet not destroyed by radiation began to appear, straddling the line between survival and monstrosity. To those who endured, time itself seemed uncertain. Calendars lost meaning when there were no governments to mark them, and each sunrise felt accidental. In that suspended moment, the world quietly reorganized itself into the wasteland, an ecosystem no longer guided by human intent, but by entropy. The silence was occasionally broken by the detonation of dormant warheads, or the distant collapse of skyscrapers succumbing to decay, reminders that the war's echoes had not finished speaking. Within underground bunkers, the descendants of the pre-war elite clung to their technologies, transmitting encrypted signals that would later evolve into myths of hidden governments and shadow powers, while on the surface, those who survived without the luxury of steel walls began to shape the new age through necessity alone. It was in this crucible of ash and isolation that humanity faced its first true test, not of strength or technology, but of meaning. Without nations, currencies, or laws, what did it mean to be human? For some, it meant cooperation, small groups pooling knowledge and labor to rebuild shelter and purify water. For others, it meant domination, raiders and warlords carving territories from the ruins, using scavenged weapons to enforce primitive hierarchies. The atomic fire had stripped away civilization's illusions, leaving only instinct, memory, and the faint residue of culture imprinted in whatever holotapes or books survived the flames. Those fragments, recordings of music, government propaganda reels, fragments of the pre-war internet, stored on decaying servers, became relics of a vanished world, hinting to later generations that humanity had once reached the stars before falling back to dust. Yet even amid this desolation, there remained a paradoxical beauty. Sunsets filtered through radioactive haze, glowing fungi illuminating subterranean corridors, the faint hum of ancient power stations still feeding electricity to no one. The Great War had ended civilization, but it had not ended life. Nature, twisted though it was, adapted more swiftly than its creators. In the months that followed the Great War, the landscape of the former United States transformed into a living archive of catastrophe, each ruin and crater a testament to the hubris of the pre-war world that believed itself immortal. The survivors who had endured the first wave of radiation sickness found themselves in a world that seemed to resist human touch. Soil poisoned by fallout, rivers glowing faintly in the night, and the air thick with microscopic particles that carried death across miles. Entire regions vanished beneath dust storms so dense they erased the horizon, while cities like Los Angeles and Boston became tombs of glass and metal where the wind howled through empty high-rises. In that endless dusk, the survivors' memories of order began to fade, replaced by rituals of survival, checking dosimeters, scavenging for unspoiled food, praying to any remnant of the old gods or new ones conjured from fear. With no central authority and no unifying narrative, the nation splintered into thousands of isolated stories, each settlement becoming a self-contained experiment in human endurance. Some banded together under the remnants of military discipline, transforming bomb shelters and bunkers into fortified communities. Others surrendered to nihilism, embracing chaos as the only truth left. In a sense, the post-war world became a mirror for the worst and best of human potential. Every act of compassion shadowed by betrayal, every gesture of creation haunted by destruction. The silence that blanketed the continent was deceptive, for beneath it lay the stirrings of transformation. Mutated wildlife reclaiming suburbs, creeping vines covering skyscrapers, and the Earth itself absorbing the scars of nuclear fire. Radiation, once considered purely destructive, became an evolutionary catalyst, birthing creatures like the radroach, the brahmin, and the deathclaw, monstrous descendants of genetic engineering gone awry. Humanity, too, began to mutate, not only physically, but culturally. Languages fragmented, old technologies became myths, and knowledge degraded into legend. Yet amid the loss, a strange resilience emerged. Scavengers learned to repair generators using pre-war schematics, half remembered from childhood. Medics rediscovered the basics of chemistry through trial and error, and storytellers began to weave the old world's memories into oral traditions that kept hope alive. For every bandit who plundered a caravan, there was a wanderer who shared purified water with strangers. For every desolate vault that became a tomb, another survived long enough to reopen its doors, releasing generations of dwellers into a world they had only known from simulation. These vault dwellers, stepping into sunlight filtered through a haze of ash, became the first bridge between the old and new worlds, carrying fragments of pre-war civility, language, ideals, technology, into the chaos beyond. They were often naive, sometimes arrogant, yet indispensable to the slow process of rediscovery that would, in time, give rise to civilizations like the New California Republic, the Brotherhood of Steel, and countless unnamed tribes. In those first decades, however, there was no grand design, only the slow rhythm of survival, the scraping of tools against rusted metal, the cautious gathering of supplies, and the haunting awareness that something irretrievable had been lost. The silence after the fire was not merely the absence of sound, but the collapse of narrative continuity. Humanity, stripped of context, had to reinvent the meaning of progress from ruins that mocked their every effort. Across the wasteland, remnants of pre-war military installations like Mariposa and Raven Rock became points of interest for scavengers who stumbled upon technologies too advanced to comprehend, while Vault-Tech's hidden experiments, psychological manipulation, genetic research, social engineering, continued to influence the human condition long after the company itself ceased to exist. The surviving AI networks, still executing fragmented directives, added to the eerie sense that the old world was not entirely gone, but dreaming in the circuitry of forgotten machines. Automated factories occasionally came to life, producing robots with no masters. Radio towers broadcast ancient propaganda on endless loops, and far beneath the ruins of Washington, the Enclave's bunkers whispered of reclamation long before they were ready to emerge. The survivors above ground could not know it, but the first steps toward the reconstitution of civilization were already taking shape, however faintly. Yet even as scattered settlements found equilibrium, bartering systems, crude governance, and rudimentary trade routes, the psychological wounds of annihilation lingered. Generations born after the Great War grew up without memory of the old world, treating its relics as holy artifacts. To them, the fire that ended history was a mythic event, both terrifying and sacred, and the silence that followed was their inheritance. They learned to read the world not through history books but through ruins, their sense of identity bound to places scorched by radiation and haunted by echoes of lost prosperity. In time, storytellers would claim that humanity's greatest mistake was not the creation of the bomb, but the belief that the world could be controlled. Yet they would also admit that without that same ambition, there could be no survival. The paradox defined the wasteland. Destruction and creation intertwined, despair and hope inseparable. As the decades stretched into centuries, the silence of the first years began to give way to voices once more. Radio transmissions, trade negotiations, songs carried across the desert night. But beneath it all, the memory of the fire persisted like an ember that refused to die. Every settlement, every vault, every wandering survivor carried within them a fragment of that moment when the world ended and began again. The Great War had not simply destroyed civilization, it had reset the human experiment, erasing the illusions of permanence and leaving behind a question that would echo through every generation to come. Could humanity, having built the tools of its own destruction, ever be trusted to rebuild? That question lingered in the silence, unanswered, as the first fragile communities took root in the ashes, unaware that their struggle to survive would one day become the foundation of a new, uncertain civilization. In the years immediately following the Great War, the surface of the former United States transformed into a landscape unrecognizable to any who had lived before, a scarred and irradiated expanse where survival required ingenuity, adaptability, and an acceptance of death as a constant companion. And it was within this harsh environment that the first real contours of the wasteland began to emerge. A new ecology that fused the remnants of human civilization with the mutations wrought by nuclear fire, where the familiar rhythms of life were replaced by the slow, measured struggle to reclaim even the most basic necessities of existence. Cities, once vibrant centers of commerce and culture, became skeletal monuments to hubris, their skyscrapers crumbling under the weight of neglect, their streets filled with debris and the occasional scavenger bold enough to risk radiation sickness for the sake of pre-war goods, while forests, plains, and rivers mutated under the influence of fallout, yielding creatures that had never before existed, such as radscorpions, feral ghouls, and the first sightings of deathclaws in the distant west, each representing nature's ruthless adaptation to the new order and simultaneously signaling to humanity that the world they had known was gone forever. The initial settlements were haphazard and precarious, often little more than makeshift camps in the ruins of pre-war towns or fortified caves, where the first survivors had learned through bitter experience that cooperation, even among strangers, was essential to endure the omnipresent threat of radiation, mutated wildlife, and rival groups of desperate humans. And in these settlements, the survivors began to re-establish some of the practices that had defined civilization before the bombs fell, from rudimentary agriculture using irradiated soil to the formation of primitive trade networks and bartering systems that, though crude, laid the foundation for more organized societies that would arise decades later. The early wasteland was also a place of paradoxical wonder, where the horror of nuclear devastation coexisted with the resilience of life, as mutated plants that glowed in the darkness provided faint illumination in underground passages, while subterranean aquifers and undisturbed pre-war reservoirs offered precious clean water to those able to find them. And in these small victories over the environment, humanity began to reclaim some semblance of control, learning to navigate a world where every step could bring either sustenance or death. Amidst this chaos, the legacies of pre-war technology became both salvation and hazard, as robotic systems like Mr. Handies and Protectrons continued their programmed routines, sometimes aiding survivors inadvertently, other times creating dangerous situations due to lack of human oversight, while scattered satellites, power plants, and automated defense installations generated a spectral presence of the old world, reminding those on the ground that civilization had existed once and might, under certain conditions, rise again. Even the human body was forced to evolve under these conditions, with ghouls appearing in response to chronic radiation exposure, some retaining their faculties, while others devolved into mindless aggression, and the earliest mutations of fauna exhibited adaptations that would shape the wasteland's food chain and territory boundaries, forcing the first communities to develop new hunting techniques, storage methods, and defensive strategies to survive the environment and the creatures that had learned to dominate it. Cultural memory also began to fracture during this period, with oral histories, salvaged books, and holotapes forming the earliest attempts to preserve knowledge, a patchwork of guidance that allowed survivors to learn which areas were most dangerous, which resources were reliable, and which behaviors led to long-term survival. And these early repositories of information, whether accurate or distorted, became the cornerstone of what would later evolve into regional customs, laws, and mythologies that shaped emerging factions and communities. Socially, the wasteland forced an unprecedented level of pragmatism, with many groups abandoning pre-war ideologies in favor of survival-driven pragmatics, forging alliances with neighboring settlements, creating rudimentary justice systems, and sometimes succumbing to brutality and raiding when resources proved insufficient, illustrating that the reclamation of civilization was not a uniform or orderly process, but a chaotic interplay of ethics, necessity, and chance, where each decision carried immediate consequences, in a world where law had no enforcement beyond the strength and cohesion of the community. Over time, certain settlements grew into proto-cities, their populations stabilized by generations born after the Great War, who understood the wasteland as home rather than catastrophe, and these locations became focal points for trade, culture, and knowledge accumulation, while simultaneously becoming targets for raiders, mutated beasts, and rival factions, embedding conflict as a permanent fixture of the reborn world and highlighting the constant tension between order and chaos that defined early post-war society. Environmental hazards shaped human settlement patterns as much as social ones, with radiation hotspots, collapsed infrastructure, and ongoing tectonic or nuclear-related events forcing survivors to remain mobile or develop extensive knowledge of local geography, and these adaptations fostered a generation of wastelanders adept at tracking, foraging, and engineering, able to manipulate salvage technology to irrigate crops, purify water, and defend against the persistent threats that the New World presented. Simultaneously, the vestiges of pre-war culture, art, music, religion, and recorded history began to influence identity formation within these fledgling communities as survivors sought meaning beyond mere survival, and in doing so, they created the early mythology of the wasteland, blending reality with legend, such as tales of untouched vaults, mysterious scientific outposts, and the emergence of enigmatic figures like the Master and early Brotherhood of Steel patrols, whose presence would shape political and social structures in decades to come. In this nascent era, humanity began to confront the philosophical implications of the post-war world, learning through observation and trial that civilization was not simply a collection of buildings or governments, but a network of relationships, knowledge, and shared values that had been fractured, and that rebuilding would require not only physical labor, but moral and cultural reconstruction, decisions that would echo in the formation of later powers such as the NCR, the Enclave, and other regional authorities. Despite the omnipresent danger, the wasteland was also a laboratory for human innovation and adaptability, producing new survival technologies, early forms of governance, and hybridized cultural practices that merged pre-war knowledge with wasteland necessity, from makeshift medicine derived from irradiated plants to improvised communication systems that allowed scattered settlements to coordinate and share resources. The birth of the wasteland, therefore, was not a single event, but a prolonged period of transformation in which humanity, stripped of the old world's conveniences and protections, was forced to confront the stark realities of existence, forging new social orders, ethical codes, and survival strategies, all while being shaped by radiation, mutation, and the persistent memory of what had been lost. And in that crucible, the first foundations of post-apocalyptic civilization were laid, a tentative, fragile promise that one day the human race might rise from the ashes, not merely to survive, but to reclaim some measure of its former ingenuity, resilience, and capacity for community, establishing the wasteland not just as a site of devastation, but as the birthplace of humanity's next chapter, the first step in the long and arduous journey of reclamation that would span centuries and define the entire post-war era. In the shadow of the Great War, as radiation-choked landscapes and the skeletal remnants of cities bore silent witness to humanity's folly, the vaults emerged not merely as shelters from nuclear annihilation, but as the deliberate instruments of one of the most ambitious social experiments ever conceived. And while many saw them as sanctuaries designed to preserve life, the truth was far more insidious. For Vault-Tec Corporation, under the guise of patriotism and scientific curiosity, orchestrated an unparalleled study of human behavior, creating a network of underground bunkers across the continent, each one engineered with unique parameters meant to test everything from social cohesion to psychological endurance. And though some vaults were built to fulfill the promise of survival with minimal intervention, the majority were laboratories in which moral boundaries were intentionally blurred. Populations subjected to deprivation, manipulation, and exposure to chemical and biological agents to gauge the long-term effects of extreme isolation, resource scarcity, and environmental stress. These experiments varied widely in scope and methodology, from vaults designed to exclude certain demographics to study prejudice and social hierarchy, to those implementing strict reproductive controls, forced eugenics, or even the exposure of dwellers to the forced evolutionary virus, a bioweapon intended to accelerate human mutation and test the limits of adaptability. And in each case, the results, if any were ever compiled or analyzed, were largely irrelevant to the people trapped within, who suffered and endured without knowledge of the external purpose of their confinement. The architecture of the vaults themselves reflected this duality of purpose, combining the outward appearance of refuge and technological sophistication with hidden mechanisms for observation, control, and intervention, from surveillance cameras discreetly installed in living quarters to computer systems designed to monitor physical and psychological metrics, all feeding data to the enigmatic central offices of Vault-Tec, where executives and scientists evaluated the unfolding experiments with a detachment that blurred the line between science and sadism. Despite this manipulation, many vault dwellers adapted remarkably well, establishing social hierarchies, traditions, and survival routines within their subterranean confines. Their resilience, a testament to human ingenuity under duress. Yet for others, the forced environment produced chaos, rebellion, or tragic decline, highlighting both the unpredictability of human nature and the limits of controlled experimentation. In some instances, vaults were constructed with elaborate contingencies that could release dwellers into the surface world decades after the bombs fell, a design intended to study not only the effects of isolation, but also the process of societal reintegration. And when these doors finally opened, the inhabitants were confronted with a wasteland, transformed in ways that Vault-Tec could not have fully predicted. A harsh reality in which survival depended on skills, knowledge, and adaptability that could never be replicated in pre-war simulations or corporate planning. In the intervening years, as vault dwellers began to explore the irradiated surface, the influence of their controlled upbringing became evident in both their successes and failures. Some communities leveraged pre-war technology and organizational knowledge to establish early centers of governance and trade, while others fell prey to environmental hazards, mutated fauna, or rival human factions, a reflection of the intricate interplay between innate human resilience and the artificial constraints imposed during their confinement. Beyond the immediate human subjects, the Vault program also had profound consequences for the broader wasteland, as experiments produced unintended mutations, both physical and social, which would ripple outward for decades, influencing interactions with early emerging factions, shaping settlement patterns, and even contributing to the development of mythologies surrounding Vault legends. Stories whispered across generations that turned the corporate machinations of Vault-Tec into folklore that simultaneously inspired hope, fear among those who had survived the surface. The most infamous of these experiments involved direct genetic manipulation, such as the injection of FEV in controlled populations, which produced supermutants in isolated instances whose later interactions with surface dwellers would alter the balance of power in regions like the Capital Wasteland and the West Coast, and the reverberations of these decisions became focal points of conflict, propaganda, and moral debate as humanity struggled to define itself in the post-war era, often without the benefit of historical context or the ability to trace causality in a world where data and records had been largely destroyed. Vault-Tec's obsessive documentation, while comprehensive in intention, was hampered by the collapse of pre-war infrastructure, resulting in fragmented archives, lost holotapes, and incomplete datasets. Yet these remnants were later rediscovered by researchers, Brotherhood of Steel archivists, and enterprising wastelanders, providing crucial insight into the experiments, while simultaneously revealing the depth of the corporation's manipulation and the ethical vacuity underlying its ostensibly humanitarian mission. Socially, the vaults became incubators of ideology, some cultivating egalitarian or cooperative frameworks, others reinforcing authoritarian hierarchies imposed by Vault overseers, and the long-term psychological effects of these formative experiences influenced how generations of dwellers perceived governance, leadership, trust, and morality, often in ways that echoed the very societal flaws that had led to the Great War in the first place. Technologically, the vaults preserved fragments of pre-war machinery, energy systems, and knowledge, acting as critical repositories that allowed humanity to begin reclaiming lost capabilities, from water purification and power generation to medical knowledge and engineering practices. Yet the very technology intended to sustain life also reinforced dependence on controlled environments, highlighting the delicate balance between preservation and stagnation, as dwellers who remained isolated for decades faced immense challenges in adapting to the unpredictable conditions of the surface. The legacy of the vaults extended beyond their immediate inhabitants. influencing the formation of factions such as the Brotherhood of Steel, which recognized the strategic importance of pre-war technology, and the NCR, which would later integrate knowledge salvaged from certain vaults into the foundations of its governance and infrastructure, demonstrating that Vault-Tec's experiments, while ethically dubious, had unintentional long-term consequences for the reclamation of civilization. Moreover, the stories emerging from vault openings shaped cultural memory across the wasteland, feeding myths of utopian havens, horrific trials, and miraculous survival, a narrative tapestry that informed alliances, rivalries, and the moral imagination of those seeking to rebuild communities in the irradiated world. And in doing so, the vaults functioned as both crucibles of human resilience and mirrors of pre-war hubris, encapsulating the complex interplay between technology, social engineering, and survival. Ultimately, the vaults embodied the contradictions of post-war human civilization. They were at once instruments of preservation and instruments of manipulation, offering refuge while simultaneously testing the limits of the human spirit. And through their doors, humanity began the painstaking process of re-emerging into a wasteland that demanded adaptation, creativity, and the courage to confront both the horrors of the past and the uncertain promise of the future, laying the groundwork for all subsequent attempts at rebuilding society and defining the moral, social, and technological contours of the post-apocalyptic world in ways that would resonate for generations. In the wake of the Great War, when the ruins of American cities lay smoldering under skies poisoned with radiation, and humanity struggled to comprehend the scale of its self-inflicted devastation, the seeds of the Brotherhood of Steel were sown in the form of a militaristic enclave that sought not only survival but the preservation and control of pre-war technology, a vision conceived by Captain Roger Maxson, a U.S. Army officer stationed at Mariposa Military Base, whose exposure to the horrors of the forced evolutionary virus experiments convinced him that the misuse of advanced technology had been central to humanity's downfall, and that the only way to prevent future annihilation was to establish an order dedicated to safeguarding knowledge from both the ignorant and the corrupt. Maxson, witnessing firsthand the mutagenic effects of FEV on soldiers and civilians alike, acted decisively, drawing a small but loyal contingent of Marines and scientists into a covenant bound by discipline, secrecy, and a rigid moral code, ultimately rejecting what remained of the pre-war government, which he regarded as irreparably compromised, and establishing a fortified sanctuary in the high deserts of California where the first doctrines of the Brotherhood could be codified and practiced without interference. And from this foundation, the Brotherhood's mission crystallized: to recover, protect, and control advanced technology, ensuring that it would be used only by those deemed worthy, and to enforce this principle with the martial rigor Maxson had learned in the Army, instilling obedience, hierarchy, and an unyielding sense of purpose into all who would join the fledgling order. The organizational structure of the Brotherhood emphasized merit, discipline, and loyalty above all else, with a strict chain of command and rituals that reinforced the sacred nature of their mission. And although initially small, this disciplined nucleus attracted survivors who shared Maxson's vision, drawn by the promise of security, purpose, and a moral framework in a world otherwise defined by chaos and violence. And as word of their effectiveness and discipline spread across the wasteland, new cells formed in other regions, each adopting local practices, while maintaining allegiance to the central principles, creating a network that, over decades, became a formidable presence capable of asserting control over critical technology. From pre-war armaments and power armor to computer networks and experimental devices, and their influence extended beyond mere military might, encompassing education, training, and cultural indoctrination, as new generations of initiates were schooled in the philosophy that knowledge without guidance was dangerous, and that the preservation of humanity required both vigilance and moral discernment, lest the errors of the past be repeated. During its expansion, the Brotherhood encountered a landscape fraught with competing factions, mutated creatures, and isolated human settlements, and in each encounter, they faced the dilemma of how to exercise authority, whether to forcibly seize dangerous technology, negotiate for cooperation, or isolate threats entirely. Decisions that defined the Brotherhood's evolving identity and its reputation across the wasteland as both protectors and enforcers, whose intervention could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe, and whose refusal could leave entire communities vulnerable to the consequences of uncontrolled pre-war relics. The ideological core of the Brotherhood was deeply intertwined with religious overtones, with technology treated as sacred and its misuse as heresy, a doctrine that influenced internal discipline, societal engagement, and even ritual combat training, creating a culture in which moral certainty, martial excellence, and technological stewardship were inseparable. And through this synthesis, the Brotherhood developed not only the capability to preserve ancient knowledge, but also the philosophical framework to guide its application, ensuring that every recovered device, weapon, or schematic was evaluated against a standard of human benefit and ethical oversight, though this often led to conflict with local populations, whose understanding of morality and survival diverged from the Brotherhood's rigid interpretations, resulting in confrontations, allegiances, and sometimes brutal enforcement actions. The early decades of the Brotherhood's existence were marked by consolidation and internal experimentation, as Maxson and his officers refined methods for training, resource allocation, and long-term planning in a post-apocalyptic environment where unpredictability was the norm, and their successes became the foundation for future generations, producing leaders capable of navigating both the moral and tactical complexities of a world where the line between civilization and savagery was constantly shifting. And in doing so, the Brotherhood became not merely a militia or technological custodian, but a stabilizing force, a living embodiment of humanity's capacity to impose order upon chaos while carrying the weight of historical consequence. As the Brotherhood expanded beyond California, splinter factions and ideological disputes arose, each interpreting Maxson's vision through the lens of their own experiences, environment, and priorities, leading to differing strategies in engaging the wasteland, whether through diplomacy, conquest, or isolation. And these divergent approaches laid the groundwork for the varied manifestations of the order seen in later eras, from the austere militarism of the West Coast chapters to the more interventionist and humanitarian tendencies observed in the capital wasteland under Elder Lyons, whose focus on aiding local populations marked a philosophical departure, while still adhering to the central principle of technological preservation, illustrating the Brotherhood's adaptability and the tension between orthodoxy and pragmatism inherent in any long-lived institution. The rise of the Brotherhood also intersected with the broader evolution of the wasteland, as settlements, raider clans, emerging nation-states, and mutated populations navigated the dual forces of chaos and order, and the Brotherhood's presence often determined the trajectory of regional development, influencing trade, safety, and cultural continuity, and in some cases, fostering early alliances with emerging powers, while in others, provoking conflict that tested both military capability and ideological resolve, demonstrating that the reclamation of civilization was inseparable from the stewardship of knowledge, and that the Brotherhood's rise was both a symptom of humanity's fragility and a testament to its capacity for disciplined organization and ethical ambition in the aftermath of annihilation. Ultimately, the Brotherhood's formation represented a profound experiment in post-war governance and cultural preservation, wherein technology became the axis of moral authority, martial discipline the instrument of enforcement, and philosophical doctrine the lens through which human survival was understood, and through their careful accumulation of knowledge, control of pre-war artifacts, and cultivation of leadership across generations, they laid the foundation for an enduring institution whose influence would reverberate through the wasteland for centuries, shaping the ethics, politics, and technological landscape of post-apocalyptic society, ensuring that the mistakes of the past were neither forgotten nor repeated without vigilance, and establishing the blueprint for one of the most consequential factions in the ongoing story of humanity's attempt to rise from the ashes of nuclear fire. In the decades following the Great War, as the wasteland slowly began to heal under the cautious hands of scattered survivors, one of the most remarkable examples of humanity's attempt to reclaim civilization emerged in the form of the new California Republic, a nation born from the ashes of Shady Sands, a modest settlement founded by former vault dwellers and pre-war citizens who had learned the value of cooperation, law, and shared governance, and who sought to create a political and social framework that could prevent the chaos that had destroyed the old United States from recurring. And while the founders of the NCR were motivated by both necessity and idealism, the development of their society was shaped as much by geography and resources as by ideology, with the fertile valleys of California providing a rare opportunity to cultivate agriculture, maintain livestock, and support growing populations. And in these early stages, the principles of representative democracy, codified law, and civic responsibility began to take root, reflecting both pre-war influence and the hard lessons of the wasteland, where survival required both individual initiative and collective organization. The early leaders of the NCR, recognizing the fragility of their nascent society, prioritized infrastructure, defense, and communication, constructing irrigation systems, roads, and fortified outposts to ensure stability and security, while simultaneously establishing mechanisms of governance, including councils and elected officials, that allowed citizens to participate in decision-making, reinforcing the social cohesion necessary to withstand external threats from raiders, mutated creatures, and rival factions. And within a few decades, Shady Sands had grown from a small, insular settlement into a burgeoning republic, attracting new inhabitants from across the wasteland and offering the promise of order, stability, and prosperity in a world still largely defined by danger and unpredictability. The expansion of the NCR was methodical and deliberate, guided by a vision of unifying the scattered populations of Central and Southern California under a single banner. And while military campaigns were often necessary to secure territory and protect trade routes, the Republic also emphasized diplomacy, negotiation, and the integration of local communities, offering citizenship and the protection of law in exchange for loyalty and cooperation, a strategy that allowed the NCR to grow not merely through conquest, but through the voluntary adoption of its political and social norms, creating a sense of shared identity that extended beyond immediate survival and fostered the emergence of a collective culture capable of sustaining itself over generations. Economically, the NCR leveraged the abundant natural resources of California, developing agriculture, mining, and trade networks that connected settlements, allowing for surplus production and the accumulation of wealth that could be reinvested in public works, defense, and social programs. And while the Republic never fully escaped the challenges of scarcity, the careful management of resources, combined with an emerging sense of civic responsibility and legal accountability, enabled the NCR to achieve a level of stability unprecedented in the post-war wasteland, demonstrating that the reclamation of civilization was possible when ideology, organization, and resource stewardship were effectively combined. Politically, the NCR faced numerous challenges as it grew, including internal disputes, corruption, and the tension between central authority and local autonomy. Yet these struggles were mitigated by the establishment of clear legal codes, codified procedures for conflict resolution, and a culture that encouraged civic participation, education, and accountability, creating a society in which citizens could engage with governance and contribute to the collective project of rebuilding, while also recognizing the limitations imposed by the harsh realities of the wasteland, where law could only be effective if supported by enforcement and the practical capacity to maintain order. Militarily, the NCR developed a disciplined, professional army, modeled in part on pre-war structures, but adapted to the exigencies of post-apocalyptic combat, capable of defending settlements, securing trade routes, and projecting power into contested territories. And this military capacity allowed the Republic not only to survive external threats, but also to enforce internal cohesion, ensuring that the principles of law, property, and civic responsibility were maintained across an increasingly diverse and geographically dispersed population, a necessity in a world where both human and environmental hazards constantly threaten societal stability. Socially and culturally, the NCR cultivated a sense of shared identity, rooted in the ideals of democracy, mutual responsibility, and collective progress, drawing upon both pre-war heritage and wasteland experience to create traditions, institutions, and civic norms that reinforced community cohesion, education, and the transmission of knowledge. And through these cultural mechanisms, the NCR was able to integrate new populations, preserve skills and knowledge, and maintain continuity with the values of pre-war society, while simultaneously adapting to the realities of a changed world, illustrating that the reclamation of civilization required not only physical reconstruction, but also the deliberate cultivation of social and cultural structures capable of sustaining human cooperation over time. Despite its successes, the NCR was not immune to the inherent difficulties of post-apocalyptic governance, facing challenges such as resource scarcity, factionalism, corruption, and the constant threat of external attack, and the Republic's leaders were forced to balance ideals with pragmatism, often making difficult decisions to preserve the long-term stability of the state, decisions that could alienate some communities while reinforcing the security and cohesion of others, a dynamic that highlighted the complex interplay between morality, necessity, and governance in a world where both the environment and human nature were unpredictable and often unforgiving. The expansion of the NCR also brought it into contact with other emergent powers, including raider gangs, the remnants of the Enclave, the Brotherhood of Steel, and later factions such as Caesar's Legion. And these interactions, whether cooperative or adversarial, shaped the strategic and political development of the Republic, forcing it to navigate diplomacy, warfare, and intelligence in ways that prefigured the complexities of modern statecraft, while remaining firmly rooted in the imperatives of survival, security, and the preservation of societal order in the post-war context. By the time of its greatest territorial expansion, the NCR had become a multifaceted polity, with functioning institutions, legal codes, military capacity, trade networks, and cultural continuity, a living example of the possibility of rebuilding civilization even amidst the persistent dangers and uncertainties of the wasteland, demonstrating that through careful planning, civic engagement, and ethical leadership, human societies could recover from the catastrophic collapse of pre-war America and establish enduring frameworks for governance, cooperation, and progress, even while acknowledging that such achievements were never absolute, always fragile, and continually subject to the pressures of environment, conflict, and human fallibility. Ultimately, the new California Republic represented the intersection of idealism, pragmatism, and necessity, a testament to the human capacity to reclaim order from chaos, to cultivate law, culture, and identity, even in a world ravaged by nuclear fire. And its story underscores a central theme in the broader saga of post-apocalyptic civilization, that the reclamation of society is neither inevitable nor linear, but a painstaking, continuous process in which survival, governance, ethics, and culture must be harmonized to ensure the fragile endurance of humanity in the aftermath of its own destruction. In the years following the collapse of the United States, as the wasteland remained a patchwork of isolated communities, emerging nation-states, and lawless territories, one of the most radical and enduring attempts to impose order arose in the Mojave region in the form of Caesar's Legion, a militant and highly disciplined empire founded by Edward Sallow, who would later declare himself Caesar, and who, inspired by the history of ancient Rome and shaped by the violence and chaos of the post-war world, envisioned a society rebuilt through absolute control, uncompromising hierarchy, and the subjugation of both human and environmental variables to his will. And while his empire was brutal, its rise reflected both strategic genius and the human inclination to seek structure in the aftermath of destruction, exploiting the fear, ambition, and survival instincts of countless displaced and desperate individuals to construct a civilization unlike any seen before in the wasteland, one that fused ideological indoctrination, religious-like devotion, and military conquest into a single, cohesive system designed to create loyalty, obedience, and expansion. The foundation of the Legion was built on the ashes of small settlements and tribal communities along the Colorado River and surrounding regions, where Sallow consolidated power by first uniting disaffected groups through persuasion, coercion, and selective violence, demonstrating early on the effectiveness of his philosophy that order could only be imposed through strength, discipline, and ritualized authority, and that the moral ambiguities of survival were subordinate to the ultimate goal of empire, and this approach proved extraordinarily effective in a world where many populations had no experience with governance beyond pre-war chaos or the occasional raider threat, and thus, the Legion's combination of fear, loyalty, and clear structure filled a vacuum that allowed Sallow to expand rapidly, drawing both soldiers and administrators into a hierarchical system that mirrored the Roman model while adapting to the harsh realities of post-apocalyptic life. Central to the Legion's ideology, was the principle that humanity required strict hierarchy and punishment to survive, a worldview encoded into its organizational structure, its training regimens, and the daily lives of its citizens, and this philosophy manifested in both ritualized military exercises and the formalized subjugation of conquered peoples, who were often enslaved or integrated into the legion's ranks, conditioned to accept their roles through indoctrination, fear, and exposure to the system's disciplined practices, creating a society in which personal identity was secondary to duty, obedience, and service to the greater whole, and where dissent was met with swift and often lethal enforcement, ensuring cohesion and stability within an inherently violent environment. The Legion's military prowess, rooted in rigorous training, strict discipline, and innovative tactics, allowed it to dominate vast swaths of territory along the Colorado River and into the Mojave Desert, incorporating both human and mechanical assets into campaigns of conquest, and in doing so, it became one of the most formidable powers in the post-war West, demonstrating that even in a landscape dominated by chaos and uncertainty, strategic vision, organized logistics, and uncompromising command could create a functioning empire, and that the reclamation of civilization could take forms that were morally complex, authoritarian, and often horrifying. Socially, the Legion imposed a rigid caste system, segregating populations by skill, loyalty, and origin, and enforcing gender and racial hierarchies that reflected both pragmatic militarism and Sallow's interpretations of Roman ideals, where the citizen soldiers were granted status and responsibility, while slaves, captives, and dissidents were subjected to the full weight of punishment, indoctrination, and labor, a structure that maintained order, incentivized loyalty, and cultivated fear as a tool of governance, yet simultaneously demonstrated the ethical costs of rebuilding civilization through coercion rather than cooperation, a stark contrast to more democratic or voluntary approaches emerging elsewhere in the wasteland, such as the New California Republic or humanitarian movements. Culturally, the Legion blended Roman symbolism with post-apocalyptic ritual, creating a narrative of destiny, divine mandate, and historical legitimacy that reinforced obedience and collective purpose, and while its ideology was inextricably tied to conquest, it also provided meaning, identity, and stability for its members, in a world otherwise defined by instability, scarcity, and the persistent threat of annihilation, illustrating the human need for structure and narrative even under the most brutal circumstances, and highlighting how ideology can function as both unifier and weapon in the process of societal reconstruction. The expansion of the Legion also brought it into direct conflict with neighboring powers, particularly the NCR, whose democratic and bureaucratic model represented a fundamentally different approach to reclaiming civilization, emphasizing law, negotiation, and trade over fear and domination. And these clashes, most notably in the Mojave, became defining moments in the post-war struggle between competing visions of order, demonstrating that the reclamation of society was not a single path, but a contested process shaped by ideology, geography, resources, and the enduring tension between freedom and control. Ethically, the Legion raised profound questions about the cost of rebuilding civilization through authoritarian control. While Sallow's system created stability, security, and functional infrastructure over vast territories, it relied on violence, oppression, and the systematic denial of individual autonomy, highlighting the paradox that civilization could be re-established yet morally compromised. and that in the post-apocalyptic world, survival, order, and prosperity often came at the expense of the values that had once defined humanity, a tension that would reverberate in the philosophical and military struggles of the wasteland for decades. Over time, the Legion's structure and culture became deeply institutionalized, with rituals, military hierarchies, and indoctrination ensuring the continuity of the Empire even as Sallow aged and died. And though the Empire would eventually face challenges from both external powers and internal dissent, its initial rise demonstrated that human ingenuity, discipline, and ideological clarity could produce a functioning society capable of long-term governance in conditions where other communities failed, emphasizing that the reclamation of civilization could take multiple forms, some benevolent, some authoritarian, and some morally ambiguous, all dependent upon the methods by which humans sought to impose order on the chaos of a world reborn from nuclear fire. Ultimately, Caesar's Legion stands as a testament to the human capacity for organization, strategic foresight, and adaptability, but also a cautionary example of how power, ideology, and coercion can shape the process of rebuilding civilization in ways that challenge conventional notions of morality, freedom, and ethical governance, demonstrating that the shadow of empire in the wasteland is as much a philosophical and moral experiment as it is a practical attempt to impose order, and that the struggle to reclaim civilization in the aftermath of catastrophe is not only a contest of survival and infrastructure, but a battle over the very soul and definition of humanity itself. Emerging from the shadows of pre-war America, the Enclave represents both a literal and ideological continuation of the federal government, a faction composed of remnants of the United States military, political leadership, and industrial elite who retreated to hidden facilities and offshore platforms in the immediate aftermath of the Great War, preserving technology, records, and a vision of national continuity while the surface world descended into chaos. And though their isolation was meant to protect both personnel and knowledge, it also incubated a doctrine of elitism, secrecy, and control that would come to define the Enclave's approach to governance and human survival, rooted in the belief that the mistakes of the old world could only be corrected through centralized authority, strict hierarchy, and the application of advanced technology to impose order upon a fractured and irradiated society. The origins of the Enclave can be traced to the immediate post-war period, when surviving pre-war leaders fled to sites such as the offshore oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico, Raven Rock Mountain Complex, and secure West Coast bunkers, where they consolidated military assets, scientific personnel, and strategic reserves of advanced technology, from nuclear warheads and power armor to experimental vehicles and weapon systems, creating a subterranean and maritime network that allowed them to maintain the semblance of the United States government, even as the continental infrastructure collapsed. And from these strongholds, the Enclave's leaders developed long-term plans to reassert control over the mainland, guided by a vision of restoring American authority, culture, and technological supremacy in a world that they deemed unworthy and chaotic. The Enclave's ideology was inherently exclusionary, defining legitimacy and citizenship in strictly genetic and cultural terms, believing that the pure descendants of pre-war Americans were entitled to govern the wasteland, while the mutated, the irradiated, and those who had adapted to the post-war environment were considered subhuman and therefore unfit to inherit or participate in the reconstruction of civilization, a perspective that drove much of the faction's later experimentation with the forced evolutionary virus and other forms of biological manipulation, as well as its often violent attempts to eliminate or subjugate populations outside its control, actions that underscored the Enclave's determination to shape the future according to its rigidly hierarchical vision, regardless of the human cost. Operationally, the Enclave maintained both overt and covert methods of influence, combining military might, advanced technology, and propaganda to assert dominance when necessary, while simultaneously attempting to cultivate a sense of legitimacy through the preservation of pre-war ideals, institutional knowledge, and governmental continuity, a dual approach that allowed them to navigate both the practical and ideological challenges of re-emerging in a fractured, post-apocalyptic landscape, and to project an image of authority that could, at least in theory, serve as the foundation for the reclamation of civilization under their terms. Technologically, the Enclave's capabilities were unmatched in the wasteland, leveraging pre-war research, automated systems, robotics, advanced energy weapons, power armor, and bioengineering projects to maintain strategic superiority over other factions. And while these resources allowed for significant tactical and operational advantages, they also reinforced the Enclave's insularity, creating a culture in which dependence on controlled environments, automated infrastructure, and selective human engagement became both a strength and a vulnerability, particularly as extended isolation increasingly divorced the leadership from the realities of surface life, where adaptive strategies, improvisation, and cooperation were essential to survival. The Enclave's early strategies for reclaiming the surface world were guided by a combination of pragmatism and ideology, emphasizing the elimination of mutated life, the reassertion of pre-war authority, and the creation of a society structured according to their interpretation of order, hierarchy, and technological stewardship, and these strategies often brought them into direct conflict with emerging powers such as the NCR, the Brotherhood of Steel, and various independent wasteland communities, whose approaches to governance, survival, and societal rebuilding differed fundamentally from the Enclave's authoritarian model, highlighting the diversity of post-war experiments in human civilization and the moral, strategic, and philosophical tensions inherent in rebuilding society after catastrophic collapse. Culturally and socially, the Enclave developed an internal hierarchy that reinforced loyalty, discipline, and ideological purity, training generations of personnel in the doctrines of technological supremacy, martial skill, and uncompromising governance, while maintaining strict control over information, movement, and social interaction within its ranks, creating a population both highly capable and intensely insular, whose worldview was shaped by a sense of exceptionalism, historical continuity, and moral obligation to restore the nation, and whose engagement with the wasteland was always filtered through the lens of preservation and dominance, rather than cooperation or negotiation. In practice, this combination of technological might, ideological rigor, and operational secrecy allowed the Enclave to execute projects of immense scope, including attempts to purge the surface of perceived threats, experiments with FEV to create controlled populations or eliminate undesirable mutations, and the reconstruction of infrastructure and governance systems designed to support their vision of an orderly, pre-war American state. And while many of these efforts failed or produced unintended consequences, the persistence and adaptability of the Enclave underscore the faction's enduring capacity to influence the post-war environment, and to pose both a moral and practical challenge to other communities attempting to rebuild civilization. Ethically, the Enclave embodies the tension between preservation and oppression, as its pursuit of technological stewardship, societal restoration, and strategic order is inseparable from coercion, elitism, and the denial of autonomy to those deemed unworthy, demonstrating that the reclamation of civilization in the wasteland is not merely a matter of survival or administration, but also a contest of values, ideology, and the definition of humanity itself, and that the choices made by those with knowledge and power carry consequences that reverberate across generations, influencing the course of societies, the distribution of resources, and the moral landscape of emerging communities. Over time, the Enclave's interactions with other post-war factions, from military engagements to strategic alliances, reveal both the strengths and limitations of its approach, illustrating that absolute control and technological superiority are not sufficient alone to rebuild a sustainable society, and that adaptability, cooperation, and engagement with the realities of human diversity are essential components of enduring civilization, a lesson reflected in both the successes and failures of the Enclave across multiple conflicts, from the capital wasteland to the West Coast, where overextension, hubris, and ideological rigidity frequently undermined its strategic objectives, emphasizing the complex balance between ambition, ethics, and practicality inherent in post-apocalyptic governance. Ultimately, the Enclave stands as a living embodiment of the ambitions, contradictions, and dangers inherent in attempts to reclaim civilization after total destruction, demonstrating that knowledge, power, and organization can preserve and restore society, but only when tempered by ethical consideration, adaptability, and an understanding of human complexity, and that the ghosts of the old world, while capable of extraordinary achievement, also carry with them the seeds of conflict, oppression, and moral compromise that continue to shape the wasteland and define the enduring struggle to rebuild a civilization worthy of survival. Amidst the relentless devastation of the wasteland, where the detritus of pre-war civilization lay smoldering and irradiated landscapes dominated the horizon, a fragile but persistent beacon of hope arose in the form of the Followers of the Apocalypse, a humanitarian organization devoted to the preservation of knowledge, medicine, and social welfare, whose existence reflected a fundamental human instinct that even in the harshest crucible of survival, the preservation of intellect, compassion, and education is essential to the reclamation of civilization. And while the wasteland is more often defined by violence, scarcity, and despair, the followers represent the deliberate choice to resist these forces, to organize not for conquest, wealth, or technological domination, but for the distribution of knowledge and aid, understanding that human survival is contingent not only upon physical sustenance, but also upon the cultivation of moral, social, and intellectual frameworks that allow societies to endure beyond the immediate moment. Founded in the remnants of pre-war educational and medical institutions, the followers drew upon surviving libraries, laboratories, and archives, seeking to salvage books, holotapes, medical texts, and teaching materials. And while their early efforts were hampered by the scarcity of resources, the dangers of travel, and the hostility of both mutated creatures and human factions, they persisted, establishing clinics, schools, and safe havens across the wasteland, often in contested regions, demonstrating a commitment to service that transcended personal survival, and in doing so, they became both a stabilizing force and a moral touchstone for communities otherwise defined by fear, opportunism, or violence. The philosophy of the followers is rooted in the belief that knowledge is not merely power, but also a moral obligation, a resource that must be protected, disseminated, and applied to the benefit of humanity. And this ethos informed every aspect of their organization, from medical interventions to educational outreach, from negotiation with local factions to the careful documentation of wasteland history, culture, and technology, creating networks of scholars, doctors, and field workers who operated in conditions where ethical clarity is rare and choices are often a matter of life or death. And in doing so, they preserved both practical skills and moral frameworks that would otherwise have been lost in the chaos of post-war society. In practice, the followers established clinics that treated radiation sickness, trauma, and infectious disease, often improvising with pre-war pharmaceuticals, purified water, and salvaged medical equipment. And their efforts were often a lifeline for settlements too small, remote, or politically neutral to attract the attention of military or factional powers, creating pockets of stability and resilience, and in doing so, they demonstrated that rebuilding civilization requires more than armies, governance, or technology. It requires care, education, and the deliberate nurturing of human capacity in its broadest sense. The organization's educators worked tirelessly to teach literacy, basic science, agriculture, and engineering, recognizing that knowledge is cumulative and that without systematic transmission of pre-war understanding, future generations would be doomed to repeat the failures that led to global catastrophe. And these educational programs were often adapted to local conditions, teaching wasteland survival alongside ethics, hygiene, and civic responsibility, demonstrating the followers' capacity for both practical innovation and philosophical consistency, and creating a model for human communities that sought to balance survival with moral and intellectual development. Despite their ideals, the followers were not immune to the political realities of the wasteland, and their work often placed them in conflict with more authoritarian factions, raiders, or those who sought to exploit knowledge for personal gain, forcing them to develop strategies for negotiation, neutrality, and defense that emphasized diplomacy and moral authority over brute force, and in doing so, they demonstrated that the reclamation of civilization is not merely a technological or logistical project, but also an ethical and social endeavor, one that requires negotiation, compromise, and the cultivation of trust within fractured and diverse human populations. The impact of the followers extended beyond immediate survival, as their preservation and dissemination of knowledge allowed for long-term recovery of technology, medicine, and governance, enabling other emergent powers such as the new California Republic, independent settlements, and even technologically focused factions like the Brotherhood of Steel to draw upon a shared repository of human understanding. And while the followers deliberately avoided domination or accumulation of material power, their influence on the wasteland's social and intellectual landscape was profound, shaping norms, expectations, and moral codes in communities that might otherwise have succumbed entirely to the nihilism and brutality of post-war existence. Moreover, the followers' ethos of compassion and education provided an ethical counterbalance to the often violent, exploitative, or authoritarian strategies employed by other factions, demonstrating that civilization can be rebuilt not only through coercion and technology, but also through care, knowledge, and moral leadership, and their example illustrates that even in a world scarred by radiation and conflict, the principles of mutual aid, intellectual preservation, and humanitarian service can take root, influencing the broader trajectory of human society and offering a model for sustainable social reconstruction in conditions of extreme adversity. The organization also engaged in research, both practical and theoretical, documenting mutations, environmental hazards, and wasteland phenomena, often producing holotapes, guides, and studies that could be shared with settlements, travelers, and other humanitarian groups, creating a network of intellectual continuity in a context where history, science, and cultural memory were at constant risk of erasure. And in doing so, they acted as archivists, educators, and ethical stewards simultaneously, preserving not just the tools of survival, but also the ideals necessary for a functioning civilization. The followers' ability to operate across factional divides, to provide assistance to any community in need regardless of political allegiance, and to maintain an ethical framework in the face of pervasive violence, scarcity, and corruption, positioned them uniquely within the wasteland's complex social hierarchy. And while their power was often subtle, consisting of knowledge, expertise, and moral credibility, rather than armies or territory, it was nevertheless transformative, influencing settlement design, public health, governance practices, and social cohesion, and ensuring that the flame of knowledge they carried continued to illuminate the wasteland's darkest corners. In essence, the followers of the apocalypse exemplify a crucial principle in the story of post-war human civilization: that rebuilding society requires more than physical reconstruction, technological recovery, or militaristic control. It requires the deliberate cultivation of knowledge, compassion, and ethical frameworks that enable humans to live together, cooperate, and thrive, even under conditions that would otherwise degrade morality and intellect. And their ongoing presence in the wasteland demonstrates that civilization is as much a cultural and intellectual construct as it is a technological or political one, and that the endurance of humanity depends upon the preservation and transmission of learning, ethics, and humanitarian care across generations. Ultimately, the followers and similar humanitarian movements represent the fragile flame of humanism in a world defined by destruction, mutation, and moral ambiguity, a testament to the fact that even when society is fractured, violent, and morally complex, the deliberate effort to educate, heal, and preserve knowledge can serve as both a stabilizing influence and a moral compass, ensuring that the reclamation of civilization is guided not only by survival or power, but also by the enduring principles that define humanity at its best, and that the light of understanding, compassion, and shared knowledge, though constantly under threat, remains the essential element upon which any lasting post-apocalyptic society must be built. In the decades after the Great War, the region once known as Massachusetts became the stage for one of the most ambitious, morally complex, and technologically advanced experiments in post-apocalyptic civilization. The Commonwealth, centering on the city of Boston and dominated by the enigmatic Institute, whose existence exemplifies both the potential and the perils of reclaiming civilization through synthetic life and scientific control. And while the surface of the Commonwealth was marked by ruin, poverty, and fragmented settlements, beneath the streets and within the Institute's secure laboratories lay a vision of order, progress, and reconstruction, where cutting-edge robotics, automation, and genetic engineering were harnessed to advance human society. And yet, this technological sophistication carried profound ethical ambiguities, raising questions about autonomy, consent, and the limits of human intervention in the natural and social order as the Institute pursued its mission to reshape the wasteland according to a vision dictated by scientific rationalism and the perceived necessity of control. The Institute's origins can be traced to the remnants of pre-war scientific institutions, preserved in subterranean facilities and shielded from the nuclear fire, where the brightest minds of Boston continued their research, isolated from the chaos above, and where long-term planning, experimentation, and rigorous methodology created an environment in which human life, synthetic constructs, and biological engineering were all manipulated toward the singular goal of societal perfection, a pursuit that reflected both ambition and hubris, and which inevitably placed the Institute in a position of both power and moral controversy within the wider Commonwealth, as their interventions, both overt and covert, affected the lives of countless surface dwellers, often without their knowledge or consent, illustrating the profound tension between technological progress, ethical governance in a post-apocalyptic context, the Institute's development of synths, androids virtually indistinguishable from humans, epitomizes this tension, as these creations served both practical and ideological functions, acting as laborers, spies, and agents of influence across the wasteland, while also challenging fundamental notions of identity, agency, and morality. And while the Institute regarded these synthetic beings as tools essential for rebuilding and guiding human society, many surface communities experienced them as threats to autonomy, social cohesion, and the principles of free will, producing conflicts that highlighted the ethical paradox at the heart of the Institute's mission, that the pursuit of progress, when divorced from human consent and traditional moral frameworks, could both advance and imperil the very civilization it sought to rebuild. Economically and socially, the Commonwealth reflected the duality of progress and illusion, as surface settlements struggled with scarcity, corruption, and vulnerability to raiders, while the Institute operated with seemingly limitless resources, technological superiority, and the ability to manipulate events from the shadows, creating a dichotomy in which apparent advancement masked deep inequalities and dependencies, and where the pursuit of order and efficiency often came at the expense of transparency, democracy, and trust, demonstrating that technological dominance alone is insufficient to achieve a truly sustainable civilization, and that progress divorced from ethics and inclusion risks producing a society that is fragile, unbalanced, and morally compromised. The Institute's control over the Commonwealth extended to education, research, infrastructure, and covert population management, producing a system in which knowledge and resources were centralized and selectively distributed, reflecting a technocratic vision in which authority is justified by expertise and capability, yet constrained by neither public accountability nor ethical oversight. And in doing so, the Institute exemplifies both the potential and the dangers of rebuilding civilization through concentrated knowledge and technological mastery, illustrating that even in a post-apocalyptic world, questions of governance, morality, and human agency remain central to the sustainability and legitimacy of any societal project. The ethical implications of the Institute's work were further complicated by the interaction between synths and surface populations, as these interactions often produced both practical benefits and moral dilemmas, from providing medical care, infrastructure support, and labor, to subtly manipulating political outcomes, enforcing compliance, or monitoring communities. And while the Institute justified these actions as necessary for the long-term reconstruction of civilization, they also underscored the inherent tension between efficiency and freedom, guidance and autonomy, demonstrating that the reconstruction of society cannot rely solely on technological mastery, but must contend with human values, rights, and the unpredictable consequences of intervention. The narrative of the Commonwealth also encompasses the emergence of surface organizations, settlements, and individual actors, from Minutemen militias and independent townships to renegade factions, each negotiating the balance between survival, governance, and ethical responsibility, often in response to both the visible and invisible influence of the Institute, highlighting the complex interplay between centralized technological authority and decentralized human agency, and illustrating that civilization, even when guided by advanced science and rational planning, is ultimately a negotiation between competing interests, moral frameworks, and survival imperatives. Politically, the Commonwealth represents a study in contrasts, as the Institute's technocratic vision exists alongside surface governments, militias, and informal coalitions that attempt to establish law, trade, and mutual protection without recourse to overwhelming technology. And this tension reflects a broader theme in the post-apocalyptic reclamation of civilization, that progress is not merely measured by infrastructure, science, or production, but by the capacity of communities to govern themselves, maintain ethical norms, and integrate human values with material and technological advancements, a dynamic that becomes increasingly pronounced as conflicts between surface dwellers and the Institute escalate into military, ethical, and social confrontations, testing the durability of civilization itself. Culturally, the Commonwealth illustrates the illusion of progress, as technological sophistication and centralized power can create an appearance of order, efficiency, and advancement, even while underlying inequalities, ethical compromises, and social tensions persist. And this duality is reflected in the lived experience of ordinary inhabitants, who navigate between hope, fear, and pragmatism, attempting to secure basic needs, preserve autonomy, and engage with larger powers that operate according to principles they neither fully understand nor control, demonstrating that the restoration of civilization is contingent not only upon technical capacity, but also upon trust, participation, and the integration of human values into social and political structures. The Commonwealth story also underscores the broader philosophical question of whether civilization rebuilt through control, coercion, and synthetic intermediaries can ever be considered truly human, ethical, or sustainable, as the Institute's vision, though orderly, efficient, and technologically advanced, raises fundamental dilemmas about autonomy, freedom, and moral legitimacy, suggesting that the reclamation of civilization requires more than the restoration of infrastructure and scientific capacity, but also the careful negotiation of human relationships, ethical principles, and social trust, without which even the most technologically sophisticated society risks replicating the flaws and failures of the pre-war world. Ultimately, the Commonwealth and the Institute represent a paradox at the heart of humanity's post-apocalyptic project, that civilization can be rebuilt through science, planning, and technological mastery. Yet without transparency, ethical grounding, and participatory governance, such progress may remain an illusion. a fragile construct that risks collapse or moral corruption, and that the pursuit of societal advancement must be balanced with human autonomy, equity, and ethical responsibility, illustrating that the reclamation of civilization is not solely a technological endeavor, but a continuous negotiation between human values, knowledge, and power, and that the story of the Commonwealth stands as both a testament to human ingenuity and a cautionary tale about the dangers inherent in attempting to recreate order through control rather than cooperation, compassion, and shared understanding. In the hills, forests, and valleys of what was once West Virginia, the reopening of Vault 76 marked both a symbolic and practical moment in humanity's long struggle to reclaim civilization, a microcosm of ambition, hope, and failure that encapsulated the fragile optimism of post-war society. As the first reclamation day saw vault dwellers emerge into a wasteland shaped by decades of isolation, mutation, and environmental devastation, where the dreams of pre-war planners and the ideals instilled within Vault-Tech's engineered society were tested against the stark realities of survival, social cohesion, and resource management. And while Vault 76 had been designed to cultivate a generation capable of rebuilding America, the reintroduction to the world above ground revealed the limits of controlled preparation, the unpredictability of human behavior, and the complex interplay between knowledge, ethics, and necessity in the creation of functional societies from the ashes of global catastrophe. The opening of the vault represented both technological triumph and ethical experiment, as dwellers were equipped with pre-war tools, education, and a moral framework designed to instill civic responsibility, cooperation, and practical skills, yet immediately confronted the challenges of establishing settlements, securing food and water, and navigating a landscape inhabited by hostile mutants, raiders, and other emergent dangers, highlighting the paradox inherent in post-apocalyptic planning, that even the most rigorous preparation cannot fully account for environmental unpredictability, the diversity of human motivations, or the moral dilemmas that arise when survival and idealism collide. And in this tension lay the core lesson of Reclamation Day, where the dream of organized civilization faced the sobering realities of improvisation, leadership, and community dynamics. Early attempts to form functioning societies outside Vault 76 involved not only the logistical organization of shelters, agriculture, and defense, but also the establishment of governance structures, trade networks, and communal norms, reflecting the essential human drive to create order, mutual aid, and predictability even amidst chaos. And these emergent social frameworks revealed both the potential and the fragility of human organization, as decisions about resource allocation, conflict resolution, and moral responsibility determined the survival, prosperity, and cohesion of fledgling communities, and demonstrated that the reclamation of civilization requires far more than technology or knowledge. The scorched plague, which erupted in the region shortly after the vault's reopening, provided a stark example of the intersection of human vulnerability, environmental hazards, and the limits of preparedness, as survivors confronted a biological threat that spread rapidly, decimating populations, forcing improvisation, and testing both leadership and social bonds. And in responding to this crisis, communities were compelled to innovate, cooperate, and develop medical, logistical, and defensive strategies under conditions of scarcity and uncertainty, illustrating that the successful reclamation of society depends upon adaptive learning, resilience, and the capacity to manage both predictable and unforeseen dangers. Technologically, the dwellers drew upon pre-war knowledge, salvageable equipment, and improvised systems to cultivate food, purify water, and maintain shelters, demonstrating the enduring utility of scientific understanding, engineering principles, and resourcefulness in rebuilding functional communities. And yet these technical solutions were always mediated by social cooperation, trust, and ethical decision-making, reinforcing the notion that civilization is not solely a product of knowledge or infrastructure, but a dynamic interplay between human ingenuity, collective effort, and the moral frameworks that govern interaction, responsibility, and accountability within emergent societies. Culturally, the reopening of Vault 76 fostered the transmission of norms, values, and collective memory, as dwellers sought to preserve pre-war knowledge, customs, and ethical principles, while adapting to the realities of the wasteland, creating hybridized social structures that combined the rigors of Vault-Tec conditioning with the improvisational demands of survival, and in doing so, they contributed to the slow reconstruction of shared identity, narrative continuity, and moral expectation, demonstrating that the reclamation of civilization is as much about preserving and adapting culture as it is about rebuilding physical infrastructure, governance, or technological capability. The experiment of Reclamation Day also revealed the human capacity for leadership, initiative, and problem-solving in extreme circumstances, as Vault dwellers assumed roles as planners, negotiators, mediators, and innovators, establishing rules, trade systems, and security measures that allowed communities to function despite external threats and internal disputes. And while not all initiatives succeeded, the process of trial, error, and adaptation provided critical lessons about human cooperation, governance, and resilience, lessons that would inform future generations and other emergent societies across Appalachia and beyond, illustrating that civilization is continually reconstructed through experience, moral choice, and social learning. Politically, the communities that emerged from Vault 76 reflected a balance between pre-war ideals and wasteland pragmatism, negotiating between self-governance, collective decision-making, and strategic alliances with neighboring groups, highlighting the centrality of negotiation, ethical deliberation, and shared responsibility in the survival and growth of human society, and demonstrating that even in an environment of extreme scarcity and danger, the structures of law, accountability, and cooperation are essential to the long-term viability of civilization. Economically, the Reclamation Day settlements relied upon both barter and improvised currency, the cultivation of food through reclaimed arable land, hunting, and foraging, and the careful management of energy and materials salvaged from pre-war remnants, illustrating the interdependence of ecological knowledge, technological adaptation, and human cooperation in sustaining a functioning community, and revealing the challenges inherent in balancing short-term survival with long-term stability and the equitable distribution of resources, a central concern in any society attempting to rebuild from catastrophic collapse. Socially and ethically, the reopening of Vault 76 confronted dwellers with fundamental questions about responsibility, leadership, justice, and the treatment of others in a context where conventional norms had been obliterated, and the responses of these communities to crises, conflict, and scarcity provided a microcosm of post-apocalyptic civilization at large, highlighting both the potential for cooperation, innovation, and moral courage, and the risks of exploitation, favoritism, and ethical compromise, and demonstrating that the survival of human society depends not only on technical skill and resource management, but on the cultivation of ethical norms, empathy, and collective decision-making under conditions of extreme stress. Ultimately, Appalachia's Reclamation Day exemplifies the complex, fragile, and iterative nature of rebuilding civilization after total collapse, illustrating that the restoration of functional communities requires a combination of knowledge, moral framework, social cohesion, and adaptive innovation, and that even carefully designed systems, such as Vault 76, must contend with the unpredictable, dynamic, and often harsh realities of the post-apocalyptic environment, yet through resilience, cooperation, and the persistent human drive to organize and improve, these communities demonstrate that the dream of rebuilding civilization, while imperfect, dangerous, and contingent upon continuous effort, remains a central and enduring aspect of humanity's story in the aftermath of global catastrophe, offering both a blueprint and a cautionary tale for all those who seek to rise from the ashes and reclaim the promise of society, order, and shared human destiny. In the ruins of the nation's former capital, the Capital Wasteland, the struggle to reclaim civilization unfolded against a backdrop of environmental devastation, political vacuum, and the persistent threat of violence, where the remnants of pre-war society, mutated life, and emergent factions collided in a crucible that tested both the capacity and the limits of human organization. And within this chaotic arena, the Brotherhood of Steel, under the leadership of Elder Owen Lyons, sought to transform from a secretive, technologically obsessed order into a force capable of asserting moral authority, protecting the vulnerable, and influencing the trajectory of societal reconstruction, attempting to balance the preservation of knowledge and advanced technology with the urgent human needs of those living amid ruin, while simultaneously navigating the complex ethical terrain of intervention, resource distribution, and the enforcement of order in a landscape where survival often required compromise, negotiation, and engagement with morally ambiguous actors. Elder Lyon's vision represented a significant evolution in the Brotherhood's philosophy, emphasizing humanitarian aid, protection of the innocent, and the cultivation of alliances with surface communities as a means of fostering stability and order. And this approach stood in marked contrast to the faction's previous insular, authoritarian model, illustrating the broader challenge of integrating ethical governance with technological stewardship in a post-apocalyptic society, and highlighting the necessity of adapting pre-war ideals to the realities of an irradiated, fragmented, and socially complex world. The emergence of the lone wanderer, a Vault 101 survivor, further exemplifies the human element in Washington's struggle for order, as individual initiative, moral choice, and adaptive problem-solving became central to the formation and maintenance of fledgling social structures, demonstrating that the restoration of civilization in the Capital Wasteland was not solely dependent upon large factions or pre-war institutions, but also upon the agency of individuals capable of negotiating alliances, solving logistical problems, and mediating conflicts between competing groups, and that leadership in such contexts required both pragmatism and ethical deliberation. The fight for clean water, a resource rendered scarce and dangerous by radioactive contamination, serves as both a literal and symbolic representation of the challenges faced by communities attempting to reclaim society in Washington, D.C. as settlements struggled to develop sustainable infrastructure, purify and distribute water, and secure resources against both environmental hazards and predatory factions, illustrating that the reclamation of civilization is inseparable from the mastery of natural systems, technological innovation, and the ethical management of shared resources, and that survival alone is insufficient, without systems capable of sustaining human life and social cohesion over time. Militarily, the region became a contested landscape, with the Brotherhood of Steel, raiders, mutated creatures, and emergent factions all vying for territory, resources, and influence. And this constant competition necessitated strategic innovation, coordination, and disciplined leadership, while simultaneously revealing the fragility of order in a society emerging from total collapse, highlighting the interplay between force, diplomacy, and ethical responsibility in the construction of lasting social structures, and underscoring that power in the wasteland is both an instrument and a constraint in the broader effort to rebuild civilization. Socially, the capital wasteland reflected a spectrum of human adaptation, from communities struggling with lawlessness and scarcity to those establishing governance, trade, and cooperative defense, demonstrating the iterative nature of societal reconstruction in the post-war context, and revealing the importance of trust, shared norms, and collective decision-making in sustaining community cohesion, and in turn, illustrating that the moral and social frameworks developed in these communities are as critical to the survival of civilization as technological capability or territorial control. The ethical dilemmas confronting elder lions, the lone wanderer, and the various factions of Washington further illuminate the tension between humanitarian intervention and the imposition of order, as choices about resource allocation, military action, and governance had consequences for survival, social cohesion, and the moral fabric of emergent society, highlighting that the reclamation of civilization is an ongoing negotiation between power, morality, and human need, and that the success of such efforts depends upon the ability of leaders and communities to balance competing imperatives, prioritize human welfare, and adapt to a constantly changing and unpredictable environment. In addition to human agency, the capital wasteland's reconstruction was influenced by environmental hazards and mutant populations, including supermutants, feral ghouls, and other irradiated life, whose presence shaped settlement patterns, military strategy, and resource management, and reinforced the principle that civilization in a post-apocalyptic context is inseparable from the natural and mutated world, requiring both technological mastery and ecological awareness to maintain sustainable social structures, and emphasizing that the survival and flourishing of communities depends upon integration with, rather than domination of the environment. Culturally, the wasteland of Washington became a site for the negotiation of identity, memory, and tradition, as survivors sought to preserve pre-war knowledge, values, and norms while adapting to the exigencies of post-war life, creating a hybridized society in which moral, technological, and social continuity were maintained, alongside innovation, improvisation, and survivalist pragmatism, illustrating that the reclamation of civilization is as much a cultural and ethical project as it is a technical or logistical one. Ultimately, the struggle for order in Washington, D.C. exemplifies the broader dynamics of post-apocalyptic society. The interplay between leadership, morality, resource management, and environmental challenge, demonstrating that the restoration of civilization is neither linear nor guaranteed, and that it depends upon the continuous negotiation between human ambition, ethical responsibility, and adaptive capacity, and that the efforts of the Brotherhood, the lone wanderer, and emergent communities collectively represent both the potential and the limitations inherent in rebuilding a society from the ashes of total destruction, highlighting the enduring truth that civilization, in any form, requires not only survival and infrastructure, but also the cultivation of human values, cooperation, and ethical engagement to endure and thrive. In the irradiated desert of the Mojave, the city of New Vegas emerged as a singular experiment in post-apocalyptic governance, economy, and social engineering, where the interplay of freedom, power, and survival was made manifest in an urban landscape reconstructed atop pre-war ruins by the enigmatic entrepreneur Robert House, whose vision of a technologically advanced, autonomous city reflected both the possibilities and the perils of rebuilding civilization through centralized control, innovation, and the manipulation of human ambition. And while House's New Vegas offered the promise of prosperity, security, and stability in a lawless environment, it simultaneously embodied the ethical complexities of human organization in a fractured world, as residents, travelers, and competing factions navigated a social order that prioritized efficiency, spectacle, and control over democratic participation, highlighting the tensions inherent in constructing society amidst scarcity, threat, and competing moral frameworks. Robert House's vision, underpinned by the preservation and application of pre-war technology, including Securitron automation, energy weapons, and advanced surveillance, allowed him to exert control over the city without relying on overt violence, creating a model of governance that blended paternalism, technocracy, and strategic foresight, and yet this control relied upon both the compliance of the population and the suppression or marginalization of independent actors, illustrating the fine line between order and authoritarianism in post-apocalyptic societies, and demonstrating that the concentration of technological power, while capable of producing stability and prosperity, also carries inherent moral and social risks, particularly when human autonomy and participatory governance are limited. The Mojave wasteland surrounding New Vegas further complicated the experiment, as the city's existence was contested by emergent powers such as the new California Republic, whose expansionist democracy sought to integrate the region into a bureaucratic and ostensibly ethical governance structure. Caesar's Legion, an authoritarian and militarized society predicated on conquest, slavery, and the reimposition of Roman-inspired order, and a myriad of independent settlements, raiders, and survivalist communities, each offering alternative models of civilization and survival, creating a dynamic political landscape in which New Vegas became both a focal point of contestation and a laboratory for observing the interaction between freedom, power, and human ambition in a post-apocalyptic context, revealing the multiplicity of strategies humanity employs to reclaim society under extreme circumstances. Economically, New Vegas functioned as both a hub and an experiment, integrating casinos, trade networks, energy infrastructure, and technological maintenance into a system that sustained the city and provided livelihoods for a diverse population, while simultaneously generating competition, inequality, and dependency, illustrating that the reclamation of civilization requires careful management of resources, incentives, and social hierarchies, and that economic stability in a post-apocalyptic environment is inseparable from political control, technological capability, and ethical governance, with the city's prosperity dependent upon both the ingenuity of its administrator and the compliance and cooperation of its inhabitants. The social dynamics of New Vegas further illuminate the complexity of post-war civilization, as residents and outsiders navigated a landscape shaped by personal ambition, factional loyalty, survival imperatives, and the negotiation of moral norms in a context where traditional law and civic authority had collapsed, producing communities, alliances, and conflicts that reflected both the adaptive ingenuity of humans in crisis and the enduring challenges of ethical governance, and highlighting that the reconstruction of civilization is as much about social cohesion, trust, and moral reasoning as it is about technology, resources, or territorial control. Militarily, the Mojave became a chessboard upon which House, the NCR, Caesar's Legion, and independent forces engaged in strategic maneuvers to assert dominance, secure resources, and influence population centers, and the presence of advanced technology, including Securitron patrols, energy defenses, and automated systems, amplified both the possibilities and the risks of conflict, demonstrating that the application of technological superiority can stabilize or destabilize social order depending on leadership, strategy, and ethical constraints, and reinforcing the principle that civilization's survival requires not only the capacity to organize and control, but also the wisdom to balance coercion, persuasion, and negotiation. Culturally, New Vegas represented a hybrid of pre-war nostalgia, wasteland pragmatism, and House's vision of post-apocalyptic urbanity, blending the spectacle of entertainment, the ritual of trade, and the logic of governance into a coherent, if ethically complex, social ecosystem. And in doing so, the city illuminated the capacity of humans to reconstruct identity, meaning, and community in a fragmented, dangerous, and morally ambiguous environment, demonstrating that civilization is a cultural as well as a material project, reliant upon the integration of history, innovation, and adaptive human behavior. Ethically, the Vegas experiment challenges the notion that post-apocalyptic order must be morally transparent, as House's governance, while effective and technologically sophisticated, relied upon paternalism, selective enforcement, and manipulation, forcing residents, travelers, and factions to navigate a moral landscape where survival, ambition, and compliance were often intertwined, and where the definition of justice, freedom, and human dignity was contingent upon context, negotiation, and power dynamics, revealing that rebuilding society after total collapse is as much an ethical endeavor as a practical one, requiring constant reflection, adaptation, and vigilance to prevent the replication of oppression, inequality, and coercion. Ultimately, New Vegas serves as both a case study and a cautionary tale in post-apocalyptic civilization, illustrating that the pursuit of order, prosperity, and autonomy is deeply intertwined with technological capacity, leadership vision, social negotiation, and ethical reasoning, and that even a city designed to embody freedom, security, and progress is subject to the constraints of scarcity, human ambition, moral compromise, and external threat, emphasizing that the reclamation of civilization is not a singular achievement, but an ongoing iterative process in which the balance of power, freedom, survival, and ethical governance must be continuously negotiated, and that the lessons of the Vegas experiment resonate across the wasteland as a demonstration of both the possibilities and limitations inherent in humanity's post-apocalyptic struggle to rebuild a society capable of enduring, thriving, and reconciling the conflicting imperatives of autonomy, security, and moral integrity. In the aftermath of global annihilation, humanity's relationship with faith, spirituality, and the metaphysical underwent profound transformation as traditional religions either collapsed under the weight of nuclear devastation or were reinterpreted through the lens of survival, mutation, and environmental extremity, giving rise to new forms of worship, myth, and ethical systems that shaped the social, political, and cultural landscapes of the wasteland. And nowhere is this phenomenon more vividly illustrated than in the rise of the Children of Atom, a faith devoted to the veneration of radiation itself as both a divine force and a transformative agent, whose adherents interpret the lingering glow of nuclear fire as a manifestation of cosmic power, sanctity, and inevitability, and whose rituals, beliefs, and community structures reflect a profound human attempt to make sense of the apocalypse, reconcile with mortality, and assert meaning within a chaotic, irradiated world, illustrating that faith in the post-apocalyptic context is inseparable from both environmental reality and human existential need. The Children of Atom emerged in various regions, adapting local myths, cultural precepts, and survival practices into their doctrine, while emphasizing the sanctity of radiation, atomic energy, and mutation as both purifying and transformative forces, and their religious hierarchy, communal practices, and esoteric knowledge exemplify how belief systems can provide social cohesion, moral guidance, and psychological stability, even in conditions of extreme deprivation, danger, and ecological collapse, while simultaneously challenging conventional notions of morality, life, and civilization, as their veneration of radiation and mutation often conflicted with the practical necessities of survival and the ethical norms of neighboring communities, creating tensions that highlight the complex interplay between faith, survival, and governance in a post-apocalyptic society. Atom's worship is not merely symbolic, but has tangible social and political implications, as followers often establish enclaves, enforce communal norms, and engage in proselytism, sometimes clashing with other factions such as the Brotherhood of Steel, the NCR, or independent settlements, illustrating that religion in the wasteland is both a unifying and divisive force, capable of inspiring cooperation, technological adaptation, and social organization, while also provoking conflict, misunderstanding, and moral tension, and highlighting that the reclamation of civilization is not only a matter of infrastructure, governance, or technology, but also of cultural negotiation, belief systems, and ethical pluralism. Beyond the Children of Atom, post-apocalyptic faith encompasses diverse manifestations of human spirituality, from localized cults and tribal mysticism to reinterpretations of pre-war religions, each adapting doctrine, ritual, and social structure to the exigencies of survival, environmental hazards, and the uncertainties of mutation, illustrating that the human impulse toward meaning-making, moral order, and communal identity persists even in the most hostile contexts, and that religious belief in the wasteland serves as both a coping mechanism and a tool of social cohesion, providing moral frameworks, narrative continuity, and motivation for action in the absence of centralized governance or reliable institutions. The technological and environmental realities of the wasteland have shaped these new religious systems in profound ways, as the visible effects of radiation, mutation, and destruction are interpreted as manifestations of divine will, punishment, or opportunity, and as a result, rituals often incorporate direct engagement with the altered environment, from controlled exposure to irradiated zones, to the collection of nuclear materials as sacred artifacts, to the integration of mutated flora and fauna into religious symbolism, reflecting the adaptability and inventiveness of post-apocalyptic belief, and demonstrating that human spirituality evolves in response to ecological, technological, and social pressures, producing complex systems that are simultaneously pragmatic, symbolic, and morally coherent within their own frameworks. The children of Atom also highlight the tension between faith and scientific understanding, as their religious doctrine interprets atomic energy and radiation in mystical terms, while surviving scientific knowledge provides empirical explanations for the same phenomena, creating a layered epistemological landscape in which magic, science, and survival intersect, and where communities must navigate competing claims about truth, morality, and the proper use of technology, illustrating that the reconstruction of civilization is inseparable from the negotiation between knowledge, belief, and ethical responsibility, and that faith can simultaneously support and complicate efforts to establish stable, functional societies. The proliferation of new gods and cults also reflects the human need to establish identity, purpose, and order in a world stripped of centralized authority, predictable social norms, and secure infrastructure. And as such, religious movements provide both moral guidance and social stability, offering rituals, narratives, and ethical frameworks through which survivors interpret catastrophe, negotiate social relations, and legitimize leadership, while also shaping political and military strategies, settlement planning, and intergroup relations, demonstrating that faith is a central pillar of post-apocalyptic social reconstruction, equivalent in importance to technology, resource management, and governance. Ethically, the rise of Atom and similar cults challenges the reconstruction of civilization by introducing moral frameworks that sometimes conflict with humanist, democratic, or secular principles. As adherence to radiation-based divinity may require the acceptance of suffering, mutation, or extreme environmental exposure as sacred or purifying, creating dilemmas for neighboring communities, factions, and survivors who must decide whether to tolerate, negotiate with, or oppose such groups, and highlighting that the reclamation of society requires negotiation not only of resources and infrastructure, but also of belief, ritual, and moral legitimacy. Politically, the influence of Atom's followers extends beyond spiritual guidance, as their organized communities, zeal, and ethical authority allow them to assert territorial control, mediate conflicts, and influence the behaviors of outsiders, demonstrating that religion functions as a form of soft power in the post-apocalyptic wasteland, shaping governance, social cohesion, and factional strategy in ways that are inseparable from the broader project of rebuilding civilization, and emphasizing that any comprehensive understanding of post-war social reconstruction must account for the intertwined roles of faith, culture, and belief in guiding human action, shaping alliances, and maintaining community resilience. Culturally, the children of Atom and similar movements contribute to the preservation and adaptation of human identity, memory, and narrative, transforming the catastrophe of nuclear war into stories, myths, and rituals that provide coherence, continuity, and meaning to communities otherwise threatened by fragmentation, mortality, and moral ambiguity, and in doing so, they illustrate the capacity of human societies to integrate disaster, technology, and survival into coherent ethical and symbolic systems, demonstrating that civilization is not only a physical or technological construct, but a cultural, moral, and imaginative enterprise, sustained by memory, creativity, and shared belief. The rise of new religious movements also underscores the interplay between adaptation and resilience, as faith provides psychological stability, moral guidance, and a framework for cooperation, enabling communities to endure environmental hazards, resource scarcity, and social fragmentation, while simultaneously shaping interactions with other factions, influencing settlement patterns, and mediating conflict, illustrating that the reclamation of civilization requires not only physical reconstruction and social organization, but also the cultivation of belief systems capable of sustaining human motivation, identity, and ethical coherence across generations. Ultimately, faith in the ashes demonstrates that the apocalypse did not extinguish humanity's spiritual, ethical, or imaginative capacities, but rather transformed them, producing new gods, new rituals, and new moral paradigms that reflect the altered material, social, and technological reality of the wasteland, and that the persistence of religion, whether in the form of atom, tribal mysticism, or hybridized pre-war traditions, constitutes an essential element in the reconstruction of civilization, ensuring that even amidst mutation, radiation, and moral uncertainty, humans retain the capacity to create meaning, coordinate ethically, and sustain social cohesion, and that these evolving forms of faith are both a testament to human ingenuity and a critical factor in the ongoing question of whether humanity can truly rebuild itself after total catastrophe. In the relentless pursuit of rebuilding civilization across the irradiated landscapes of the wasteland, humanity confronted the often devastating consequences of ambition, innovation, and the drive to restore order, as the very efforts to reclaim society frequently carried with them moral compromises, social upheaval, and cycles of violence that mirrored the failures of the pre-war world. And the cost of progress manifested not only in the material destruction left by conflict and technological experimentation, but also in the erosion of ethical standards, the exploitation of vulnerable populations, and the establishment of systems of power that perpetuated inequality, oppression, and dependency, illustrating that the reconstruction of civilization is inseparable from the ethical, human, and social dimensions of action, and that every technological advance, territorial conquest, or political maneuver carries repercussions that shape the moral and practical landscape of emergent societies. The expansion of the new California Republic, for example, demonstrates both the promise and peril of organized governance, as the Republic sought to bring law, infrastructure, and bureaucratic order to vast swaths of the post-apocalyptic West. Yet in doing so, it frequently imposed burdens upon local populations, provoked violent resistance, and prioritized institutional consolidation over the welfare of individual communities, revealing that progress in the form of democracy and bureaucracy can replicate hierarchies, exclusions, and coercive structures, even when grounded in ostensibly benevolent ideals, and highlighting that the reclamation of society is fraught with tensions between collective order and individual autonomy. Caesar's legion, in stark contrast, exemplifies the extreme costs of civilization imposed through violence and authoritarian ideology, as Edward Sallow's militarized state, modeled upon a brutal interpretation of Roman principles, relied upon slavery, conquest, and rigid social hierarchies to establish order and productivity, demonstrating that the pursuit of societal coherence without ethical constraint can produce efficiency, stability, and cohesion at the expense of human rights, dignity, and moral integrity, and emphasizing that the success of post-apocalyptic civilization is measured not solely by organizational capacity or territorial control, but also by the preservation of ethical norms and the capacity for human flourishing. Technological advancement, particularly in the hands of the Brotherhood of Steel, the Institute, and other high-tech factions, further illustrates the double-edged nature of progress, as the accumulation and application of pre-war knowledge enabled remarkable achievements in medicine, defense, and infrastructure, yet also created dependency, social stratification, and moral ambiguity, as technological superiority could be wielded to dominate, exploit, or manipulate populations, underscoring that innovation divorced from ethical oversight carries profound risks, and that the reconstruction of civilization requires not only mastery of material systems, but also the cultivation of moral frameworks capable of guiding the responsible use of power and knowledge. The human cost of progress is further evident in the cycles of war and retribution that characterize the wasteland, as factions compete over territory, resources, and ideology, often perpetuating violence across generations, and demonstrating that the rebuilding of society is inseparable from the management of conflict, negotiation of peace, and reconciliation of competing claims to legitimacy, and that failure to address these social and ethical dimensions can undermine the very foundations of civilization, even amidst technological and organizational advancement. Slavery, forced labor, and exploitation emerge repeatedly as consequences of societal reconstruction. From Caesar's legions' institutionalized bondage to the coercive practices of smaller factions seeking survival or advantage, revealing that human suffering is often a byproduct of attempts to impose order and productivity in a resource-scarce and morally ambiguous environment, and highlighting that the ethical costs of progress are inseparable from its material and organizational dimensions, with the welfare of vulnerable populations serving as both a litmus test and a moral constraint on the legitimacy of emergent civilizations. Environmental manipulation and the use of radiation, technology, and infrastructure further demonstrate the material costs of post-apocalyptic reconstruction, as efforts to secure water, energy, and arable land frequently produced unintended consequences, from ecological degradation to public health crises, illustrating that even the most sophisticated planning is contingent upon adaptive management, local knowledge, and ethical consideration, and that the reclamation of civilization is fundamentally an exercise in balancing human ambition, ecological stewardship, and social responsibility, in a context of profound uncertainty. Culturally, the cost of progress is reflected in the erosion and transformation of pre-war social norms, traditions, and ethical frameworks, as the exigencies of survival, factional competition, and technological change reshape communities, hierarchies, and belief systems, producing moral compromises, hybridized practices, and new social dynamics that illustrate both human adaptability and vulnerability, and emphasizing that civilization is not a static achievement, but a dynamic process in which cultural continuity, ethical deliberation, and social cohesion must be actively maintained. The tension between progress and morality also manifests in the manipulation of knowledge, as factions like the followers of the Apocalypse, the Institute, and the Brotherhood of Steel navigate the preservation, application, and control of information, demonstrating that the stewardship of knowledge is both a powerful tool for rebuilding society and a potential source of oppression, dependency, and ethical compromise, and highlighting that the reclamation of civilization entails not only physical reconstruction, but also the careful cultivation of information, transparency, and trust within human communities. Ultimately, the cost of progress is both material and human, encompassing loss of life, moral compromise, social stratification, environmental damage, and the potential for the repetition of pre-war failures, and yet it is also inseparable from the very possibility of rebuilding civilization, illustrating that the pursuit of survival, order, and advancement necessarily entails risk, ethical negotiation, and the careful balancing of competing imperatives, and that the history of the wasteland demonstrates repeatedly that progress without reflection, cooperation, and moral guidance can replicate destruction, even as it creates new opportunities for life, community, and knowledge. In this sense, the wasteland is both a cautionary tale and a laboratory for the study of civilization, as each technological breakthrough, factional conquest, and social innovation reveals the duality of human endeavor, showing that the reconstruction of society is inherently contingent, ethically fraught, and dependent upon the ability of communities to integrate survival, knowledge, and morality into sustainable systems, and that the lessons of the wasteland emphasize the necessity of vigilance, adaptability, and ethical foresight in every act of rebuilding, from the most modest settlement to the most technologically advanced city. Ultimately, the cost of progress underscores a central paradox of post-apocalyptic civilization, that the very actions required to restore human society, organization, innovation, technological mastery, and consolidation of power carry inherent moral, social, and environmental risks, and that the legitimacy, stability, and durability of reconstructed civilization depend upon the capacity to recognize, mitigate, and integrate these costs into the ongoing project of survival, community, and ethical governance, ensuring that the flame of human achievement does not consume the very values, rights, and humanity it seeks to protect, and that the wasteland, for all its devastation, remains a testament to both the possibilities and perils of rebuilding civilization from the ashes of total destruction. As the sun rises over the irradiated ruins, the fractured communities, technological enclaves, and emergent civilizations of the wasteland stand as both testimony and question, a reflection of humanity's capacity to endure, adapt, and rebuild after the cataclysmic destruction of the Great War, yet also as a stark reminder of the fragility, imperfection, and ethical complexity inherent in all attempts to reclaim order from chaos, and the cumulative story of vault dwellers emerging into scarred landscapes, the establishment of the Brotherhood of Steel, and the new California Republic, the authoritarian rise of Caesar's Legion, the hidden machinations of the Institute, the idealistic but tentative attempts of the followers of the apocalypse, and the resilient, if morally ambiguous, societies of Appalachia, Boston, Washington, and New Vegas converge to illuminate a central question. Has humanity truly rebuilt civilization, or merely reconstructed the patterns of hubris, inequality, and conflict that precipitated its near annihilation? And while technological innovation, social experimentation, and the persistence of faith, culture, and moral reasoning have enabled survival, prosperity, and localized advancement, These achievements are inseparable from the compromises, failures, and ethical tensions that continue to shape the post-apocalyptic world, suggesting that the reclamation of society is not a finite endpoint, but a continuous, iterative process, fraught with uncertainty and contingent upon human vigilance, wisdom, and cooperation. The interplay of individuals and factions across the wasteland underscores the duality of human endeavor in the reconstruction of civilization, as figures such as the Lone Wanderer, Elder Lions, Robert House, Vault Dwellers, and countless unnamed survivors exercise agency, innovation, and moral judgment while navigating environmental hazards, scarcity, and competing social norms, demonstrating that the survival and flourishing of society depend upon both the mastery of material conditions and the cultivation of ethical, social, and cultural cohesion, and that civilization is ultimately as much a product of human decision-making, collective values, and adaptability as it is of technology, governance, or infrastructure. The tension between technological mastery and moral responsibility, exemplified by the Institute, the Brotherhood of Steel, and New Vegas, illustrates that progress without ethical grounding risks replicating patterns of domination, exploitation, and collapse, emphasizing that the reclamation of civilization requires the integration of knowledge, power, and morality in ways that are accountable, participatory, and resilient, and that the survival of communities is dependent not only on physical and logistical competence, but also on the capacity to negotiate justice, autonomy, and social cohesion in environments shaped by scarcity, conflict, and uncertainty. Faith and culture, represented by the children of Atom, tribal groups, and hybridized traditions emerging across the wasteland, serve as critical mechanisms for the preservation of meaning, continuity, and social identity, revealing that human societies reconstruct not only infrastructure and governance, but also moral frameworks, narrative coherence, and ethical norms, and that these cultural dimensions are essential for sustaining motivation, trust, and cooperation in the long-term project of rebuilding civilization, highlighting the inseparability of belief, social structure, and survival in a post-apocalyptic context, the ethical and human costs of progress manifested in slavery, exploitation, warfare, environmental degradation, and the erosion of moral norms, underscore the paradox that the very acts intended to restore society often perpetuate suffering and instability, reflecting the complex balance between ambition, survival, and moral responsibility, and illustrating that the measure of successful civilization is not only the ability to organize, govern, or innovate, but also the capacity to minimize harm, preserve dignity, and cultivate justice in conditions of extreme adversity. The iterative nature of reconstruction across the wasteland, from the strategic governance of House in New Vegas to the grassroots organization of Appalachia's Vault 76 survivors, demonstrates that civilization is a process rather than a static achievement, contingent upon continuous adaptation, negotiation, and reflection, and that the lessons learned from these microcosms, successes, failures, ethical dilemmas, and practical solutions provide guidance for future generations seeking to navigate the complexities of survival, social cohesion, and human flourishing in a world still recovering from annihilation. Politically, the coexistence of democratic experiments, authoritarian regimes, technocratic enclaves, and religious movements highlights that the rebuilding of civilization involves multiple models of governance, each with strengths, weaknesses, and ethical implications, and that the long-term viability of society depends upon the capacity to integrate diverse systems, mediate conflict, and reconcile competing claims to legitimacy, power, and authority, underscoring the fundamental principle that civilization is sustained not solely by coercion, technology, or organization, but by the deliberate cultivation of cooperation, trust, and moral accountability. Environmentally, the wasteland itself remains a persistent challenge, as radiation, mutated flora and fauna, resource scarcity, and climate extremes continually test the adaptability, ingenuity, and resilience of human communities, demonstrating that the reclamation of civilization is inseparable from ecological awareness, sustainable resource management, and the capacity to live in harmony with, rather than domination over, altered ecosystems, and that human survival and societal stability are contingent upon the integration of environmental and understanding into every aspect of governance, economy, and culture. The question of tomorrow, therefore, encompasses both the achievements and the limitations of post-apocalyptic society, as the wasteland is at once a canvas of human ingenuity, resilience, and moral reflection, and a landscape of fragility, inequality, and recurring ethical tension, suggesting that civilization is never fully rebuilt in the sense of perfection, but is perpetually reconstructed, negotiated, and adapted to the contingencies of environment, technology, and human behavior, and that each generation inherits not only the material and institutional legacies of its predecessors, but also their unresolved ethical dilemmas, social patterns, and moral challenges. Ultimately, the enduring question remains whether humanity is capable of transcending the cycles of destruction and hubris that led to the apocalypse, whether knowledge, morality, and cooperation can be integrated effectively to sustain civilization over the long term, and whether the lessons of the wasteland, from Voltec's experiments and the Brotherhood's stewardship to the NCR's democratic ambitions, Caesar's legion's authoritarian rigor, the Institute's technological mastery, the Children of Atom's spiritual adaptation, and the everyday decisions of countless survivors, will cumulatively guide humanity toward a more resilient, ethical, and sustainable society, or whether the reconstruction of civilization will inevitably reproduce the flaws, conflicts, and failures of the past, in reflecting upon the entirety of the post-apocalyptic struggle, from the silent devastation following 2077 to the fragile yet persistent emergence of new social, technological, and moral orders. It becomes clear that the reclamation of civilization is a dynamic, ethically fraught, and endlessly iterative process, one that demands the integration of survival skills, technological innovation, social cohesion, ethical reasoning, cultural continuity, and adaptive leadership, and that the wasteland, in all its ruin, mutation, and human endeavor, stands simultaneously as a testament to human resilience and a profound question about the durability, morality, and future of civilization itself. A question whose answer remains open, contingent, and inseparable from the ongoing choices, values, and aspirations of every survivor navigating the unsteady terrain of the post-apocalyptic world.